Measuring Intelligence in Infants and Young Children, Cynthia Rivera, Kaiser University, Site 570, Test and Measurements, Dr. Whitaker, June 27, 2020. Overview. Let's take a look at what intelligence is. Intelligence can be best defined as a multifaceted capacity, which manifests itself into various ways through one's lifespan. Cohen and Swerlick, 2018, page 273. Intelligence branches further into abilities that allows an individual to acquire as well as apply knowledge, reason logically, plan effectively, infer perceptively, make valid judgments and create solutions, grasp and visualize concepts, focus, be intuitive, choose appropriate wordings and thoughts related to facility, cope, adjust, and make most of new situations. Overview continued. However, when working with infants and children, it is defined in terms which emphasizes positivity and interpersonal skill. For children in older age, it is defined as one's academic skills. An overall agreement on the term intelligence is that it has become a term tied to various meanings, and now has none. Now knowing what intelligence is, here's a quick overview on measuring intelligence. In order to measure intelligence, the researcher must sample a participant's performance throughout each different task in the test as a function of developmental level. In each of these developmental levels, the intelligence assessment process includes a standardized event in which the examiner may closely observe the examinee's approach to each task. This provides the assessment itself to be of great use in outside settings filled with diversity, such as schools, military, and business organizations. To tie this together now, understanding both intelligence and measurements, if one goes deeper into why measuring intelligence became important in infant and young child's development, the answer could be found that during infancy, these intelligence tests predominantly assessed and measured the infants for sensory motor development. Cohen and Swerlick, 2018, page 286. During these ages of infancy and early childhood, the child is measured based off of their outside impacts, parents, grandparents, guardians, etc. Simply because in these ages, the child cannot understand terms such as cooperation and patience. These type of measuring assessments follow through until the child is of older age, in which the assessment on the child's intelligence are done in verbal and nonverbal procedures to measure the intelligence and performance abilities of the child and responsibilities of themselves. Importance and application in current society. In a research article written by Hans J. Eisnick, 2007, it was mentioned how measuring the intelligence of infants and young children has created new developments. There were also recent mentions of Guilford's structure of the intellect model in current research as well. Measuring the intelligence of infants and young children in today's society has also created advances to the theories that relate to intellectual differences and IQs. To further explain why measuring the intelligence of infants and young children is imperative, one can take a look at how these measurement results have opened more doors in better understanding child development. It has even allowed for better living for the participants who have been studied through assessment and accurately measured. Another thing that these measurements on intelligence related to infants and young children have created were platforms for researchers to conduct other measurements on other aspects of child development, such as the measurements of emotions in infants and young children. Izzard, 1982. By measuring a child's intelligence, this gave researchers ability to detect emotional intelligence. An example, stress and anxiety. That can be a factor for poor measurements in intelligent testing. With so much ability to understand a child's emotional and intellectual levels through measurement, specialists have been able to create treatments today that would allow the individual to properly function in both inter- and intrapersonally in environments, such as schools and in the workplace. Importance and application in current society continued. Other research has proven that through studies of intelligence and measures, that psychologists and other specialists have been able to not only detect these intellectual and emotional deficits, but also assist in children in developing in these areas, as previously stated, through interdisciplinary procedures and using multi-methods. This has been proven to bring together students, clinicians, parents, and educators. Testing and measuring has brought in measurements to different aspects aside from emotional and intellectual, including personal and practical intelligence. Baron, R. and Parker, JDA, ed. 2000. Measuring of intelligence has allowed researchers to create programs for educational purposes to educate children in becoming more emotionally and socially intelligent, and later on programs for the workplaces needed in departments such as HR, management, etc. Some tests used in educational and work fields that are used today are group intelligence tests, individual intelligence tests, computerized tests, and lastly, verbal, nonverbal intelligence testing. Lodge-Dons, A. 2021. Historical information. The history on measuring infants and young children's intelligence dates back to the 19th and 20th century. The initial study of child development and reasoning for measuring an infant and child's intelligence was simply due to the belief that idiots, which had been the approved term for lowest classified mentally retarded, displayed mental deficiencies as early as the age of 2. Brooks J. Warnrob, M. 1976. The first scientific assessment that tested and measured intelligence was constructed by Alfred Binet in the beginning of the 1900s. His reasoning for creating and conducting these intelligence tests on children had been to create a reliable method in which educators were allowed to discriminate those with special needs from the general population for classroom placement purposes solely. Bennett attempted measuring child's intelligence through assessments on various facets of their ability to reason and think. This method allowed Bennett to properly predict the most accurate learning environment for the child. However, it was well known that children had the raw capability to advance and expand in development with time, and it was imperative to take age into account when discussing a child's intelligence. Without a talking age taken into accountability, a smart child would seem less intellectual than the next. Morelli, A.O., 2021. It was Darwin and Preyer who took interest in the infancy stages of childhood and early development. With impressive studies, accuracy, and test results, measuring of intelligence in infants and children began to develop in settings such as Yale, Minnesota, Berkeley, and even Iowa. They continued on into the early 1830s, growing in widespread acceptance. Researchers create a vast series of tests and studies measuring and scoring. Retests had even been conducted for reliability and validity in order to properly test, measure, and detect defects in infancy and childhood. Assessments used today. In a previous slide, it was briefly mentioned that some tests are still used in settings that involve education and work. Work fields require completion of questionnaires based on hypothetical events to test and measure one's character, choice of judgment, and ability to create the appropriate solution. However, tests that are still used and are true to measuring of infants and young children are the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, WISC-IV, and the Wechsler's Adult Intelligence Scale, WAIS-III. Other tests that measure infant and child intelligence are the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Test, Differential Ability Scales, TAS, and the Peabody Individual Achievement Test. These exams explore, test, and measure areas in the child's development from linguistics, logical mathematics, body kinesthetic, interpersonal, and intrapersonal aspects. These tests have been used to measure the intelligence in children, not only for educational purposes, such as an accurate class placement, but also because it has been proven that children suffering from learning disabilities also display severe behavioral disturbances. To avoid unnecessary hospitalizations and wrongful actions taken with the child, which can hinder their developmental growth, these tests are still being put to use. Ethical, cultural, and societal issues. As all great test experience, testing and measuring on infants and young children come with a vast amount of ethical, cultural, and societal issues. Examiners must be very mindful, not only for the child, but the family as well, when conducting these tests and procedures. It is important that examiners follow ethical and legal codes, such as collecting parental consents, respecting the autonomy of the child, keeping the confidentiality of the test and participant, appropriately dissecting the child from parental distance for assessments, using appropriate measures, etc. There are many guidelines that ensure competency of evaluation regarding the children, including the assessment process's nature and the critical role for parents. Posada, M. 2004. Another article further explained how both use and misuse of measuring and testing on infants and child intelligence. Michael Lewis, 1973, explained in the earlier 70s that some ethical concerns were that intelligence tests were unmeasurable, stable, and unitary to construct. He feared that validity would lack despite the use of every instrument used to assess intelligence in infancy. In today's society, it is important that tests on intelligence does not negatively affect the child. It must not offend other cultures, communities, nor discriminate against any child. These tests must not cause physical harm to the child in any way, even after matter of testing. Testers must ensure the child's safety physically, mentally, and emotionally at all times.